Hello, everybody. This is Bart, and today for my major presentation for sacred music, I'll be talking about the two exceptions to the rule, the Glagolithic and Huron liturgies. So, most of you guys know that Latin was the main liturgical language in the western half of the church, right, as opposed to the eastern part of the church, for most of like the 2,000 years. It really comes up even right, we've learned right after Lutheranism, or Martin Luther comes in, his first missal is still in Latin, right? But really, we have both practical and spiritual and theological reasons for keeping Latin a liturgical language, and why it's been kept like that for such a long time. The biblical foundation that we can see is especially in the Passion, where whenever in the Passion where Christ is crucified in John 19:20, the Romans write Jesus' name, Jesus Nazareus Rex Judaeorum, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, in both Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. Greek and Hebrew are more obvious, right? Because to us, those are the language of the scriptures. But Latin being also one of the common languages, it was the lingua franca of the Roman Empire. The primary language in the Western Church, at least, for liturgy was Greek until around the 8th century. And right, this is a gradual process. This didn't just happen in the 8th century where, boom, it was Latin. It was very gradual. As more and more people started to speak Latin or variations of Latin, right? The Romance languages are all essentially variations of Latin. So we get Spanish, we get Italian, we get French, and they're all very close to Latin. So it would make sense to use a language that's close to some of these, most of these, but it's still set apart. It's not something that you can just use for every day, using it for, using the same language to buy deli at the market and the same way that you praise the Lord in church. The first Latin liturgies come to us from North Africa. So places like Hippo, right, where St. Augustine was bishop at some point. Invasions from barbaric tribes, right, such as the Visigoths and Goths, eventually influenced Latin's utility. What do I mean by utility? In the sense that it's now a unifying bond between all Christians, whether they're from way up north or way out west, like the Visigoths. We can now worship under one language, whatever ethnicity we are, whatever language we are, right? Because the Anglo-Saxon and Visigothic and Gothic languages were pretty far from Latin, but so it made sense for all of us to worship under one language, right? And also, I'd say that another benefit, the last benefit of Latin, there are many more, but I don't want to get into it too much, is the theological unity. And since Latin basically stops developing by the Middle Ages, Roman Catholics have used it as an unchanging foundation for correct and accurate theology, right? Because since our language keeps developing on and on, it's very easy to just keep making and updating and revising all these missals and Bibles to fit the common language, right? But if we have at least, and which is good, right? It isn't bad. But at the same time, if we have an original that's very close, the quasi-original, right? That's very close to to the Hebrew and to the Greek, it'd be very good because it's a dead language, which is actually good for us, and that the meaning doesn't change since, right, it's not living. Now, why do I talk about this? It's because Latin was the normative way to celebrate Mass and be used in the liturgy, right? However, there were a few exceptions that either the Pope made or missionaries made whenever they'd evangelize to countries wherein the language was very far from Latin. Examples, and the only two that I'm going to talk about, are the Huron people in Canada, near New York and Lower Canada, basically near Lake Ontario, and also the Slavic peoples. In addition to that, there were others such as in southern Africa. This is something that happened with Catholic missionaries that came there in the 1930s with Afrikaans as well. But also this happened in China. because Chinese and a lot of the Asiatic languages are quite far from Latin. But anyways, let's start with the two that we're going to go into. The Glagolithic Mass. So let me give you some background history. Charlemagne, we all know him. Charlemagne sends Bavarian bishops in the 9th century or 8th century to evangelize through the Roman Rite, but in Latin. And the Slavic people don't really like that. They're like, okay, what's this whole Latin language thing? The Moravian prince, Rastislav, wants to be independent from their influence, so he asks the Byzantine emperor to send missionaries and a bishop and a teacher to teach us Greek, also to give us the Byzantine Rite. At this point, they're already, Prince Rastislav in this case is already Christian, but he wants a more Byzantine flavor of Christianity, right? Now, Saint Cyril and Methodius. These are the two missionary brothers, also known as the Apostles to the Slavs. They were born in Thessalonica in the 800s, which is in Greece. So their native liturgy was the Byzantine Rite, which, right, makes sense. And it would make sense for them to bring their native rite to the Moravian kingdom, which in that at that time it included modern day Bulgaria, Macedonia, and Croatia in the 9th century. So in the 850s, they're sent by the Byzantine emperor. However, the Slavic people at that time don't have a unified script. They have a unified tongue. They're all speaking variations of Slavonic. So that's why you'll hear like Church Slavonic. Slavic are the people. Slavonic is the language. And in this case, right, we use or Cyril, Saint Cyril, basically makes up or discovers. There's a theory that it's actually a discovery of the Glagolithic script. And this is what's actually really fascinating, is that scholars say today that he made it up. However, there was a theory in the Middle Ages, and it's most likely false. We don't really know, but that this is actually the alphabet of Saint Jerome. Who's Saint Jerome? Saint Jerome is the early church father that translated the Hebrew and Greek Bible into Latin. But what does he have to do with the Slavonic tongue, or maybe even the Glagolithic script? Well, I won't go too much into it, but he was born in Dalmatia, and Dalmatia is part of, linguistically, the Slavonic lands. So it's very possible that he made up this script, and that's how essentially Saint Cyril and Methodius might have sold the Glagolithic script to them, to especially the Pope. So the Slavic tongue is too far away from Greek or Latin. So that's why there needs to be a script. And Cyril and Methodius want to translate the scriptures into that tongue for them. Which at this point, this is not common at all, especially in the West, into that kind of bridge. And that's what like Eastern Europe is. Eastern Europe is right now acting as a bridge between the East, right, Constantinople, and the West, being Rome. Alphabet is devised Glagolithic, and eventually it's called Cyrillic and becomes more Greek. But I'll show you guys examples of what it looks like. But there's heavy criticism from the West, right? Those same Bavarian bishops that were sent to evangelize through the Roman Rite in Latin were criticizing Cyril and Methodius. They were like, Slavonic isn't one of the 3 original languages that was written, right, on the cross at Jesus' crucifixion. Eventually the Pope will go into this, but the Pope says, you know what, actually God created all languages, so it'd be fine to praise him with this language, especially for these people. We'll make an exception. So this is what Glagolithic looks like. On the right we have some parchment, what it would look like handwritten, and on the left is the more alphabetical equivalent of it, right? We have like Latin letters on the side as well. But see, it doesn't look like Greek. There are only a couple letters like next to R on the right column that look more like Greek and Russian, or the F on the very bottom of the first column, the F sound. Otherwise, they're very geometric. It's kind of bordering into the hieroglyph kind of side of script. So we don't really know the origins of this. Some of it might even be symbolic. There are some people out there that think that the shapes mean something, have a deeper symbolic meaning. But we talked about, right, this criticism, and this, we've always assumed, or not always, but for a long time we've assumed that, or scholars have assumed that the Byzantine Rite was the only rite that was sent to the Slavic lands. However, in 1874, a monk in Jerusalem, who was studying in Jerusalem in the monastery of St. Catherine in Sinai, Egypt, found parchments that was later called the Kiev Missal. When they started translating it, well, it was in Glagolithic. When they started translating it, they noticed similarities in that it contained Slavonic translations of parts of the Roman Mass. And scholars eventually dated it to no later than the 10th century. It was very close to a sacramentary from Padua, which eventually was traced to the Gregorian sacramentary. Where's the Gregorian sacramentary? In Rome. So it's very possible that while St. Cyril and Methodius, while they were in Rome, they not only brought their Byzantine rite to the Slavic people, but they also brought the Roman Mass. But it was the translated Roman Mass. Why do we think that? Michael Latzko, a Jesuit from the 60s, believes this, that they informed the Latin missionaries, Cyril and Methodius knew that the Latin missionaries were already in Moravia, and they would have been used to the Roman Rite. But Cyril's like, okay, plot twist, we're going to give them the Roman Rite because they're probably already used to it after 100 years of evangelization from Charlemagne's bishops, but we're going to give it to them in their own language. So there's this right beautiful kind of mix, a hybrid of let's use an Eastern tongue, a non-usual Roman tongue, and with the Roman Rite. We hear from Vita Constantini, which Constantine is the lay name, the baptismal name of St. Cyril. But this is basically his biography from the Middle Ages. Quote, Pope Hadrian II blessed there Cyril and Methodius' teachings, but put Gospels in Slavonic at the altar of St. Peter the Apostle, and Holy Liturgy was sung upon them. Then he ordered the Slovian disciples to be ordained by 2 bishops, Formas and Gondrich. And after they were ordained, they sang the liturgy in the temple of St. Peter the Apostle in Slavonic. Imagine, not only probably in St. Peter's Basilica, in the temple of St. Peter the Apostle, was Greek sung, Latin, but even Slavonic. It's quite amazing to see that even in the 10th, 9th century, this might have happened, right? Here is the Kiev Missal. Here's a leaf of the Kiev Missal. As you can see, there's black ink and there's red ink. A lot of us have seen it. They say the black, do the red. The red are the rubrics, essentially, right? The rubrics of the Mass, for the priest to do specific actions. That's what that says. And then the prayers are written in black. I really wish I could read Glagolithic. I tried to teach myself. It is very hard because there are no real spaces between words, and I don't know exactly what I'm looking for when I start translating them letter by letter. And there are some letters that don't even exist in Russian anymore, or even in Cyrillic anymore. So it's kind of strange. Later usage, right? This doesn't go away entirely, but as Croatia, Moravia, Slovenia start using the Latin alphabet into their own colloquial tongue, Glagolithic also basically adopts. The Glagolithic alphabet eventually gets thrown out, supplanted by the Latin alphabet. Now the liturgy still, in parts of Croatia, is in Slavonic, but it uses the Latin alphabet. And in the 1630s, the Pope basically gave a revised edition of the Glagolithic Missal, and we'll see scans of this, where there are side-by-side an interlinear translation of the Mass, both in Slavonic, right, but one in Glagolithic script and one in the Latin alphabet. And again, I say Latin alphabet, it's the alphabet that we're used to, not the Latin language. Now, it's used in Zagreb, which is the capital of Croatia, by some priests. So we'll see this. So here are some actual parts of the missal. On the left side, if you guys can maybe recognize on the bottom part, da 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 da. It's the Our Father. It's the Our Father prayer sung by the priest during a high mass. And I wish I could zoom in right now, but if you see the Latin alphabet on the top, Отче наш, иже еси на небесех, светися имя Твое. Right below it is the Glagolithic script. On the right, we have the Czyń Misy, which is the beginning of Mass. And these are the prayers at the foot of the altar, the dialogue between the priest and the altar server. And we're going to look at a video, actually, of a low Mass. Not the whole thing, but just some excerpts on how it sounds. I wish we had recordings of a high Mass in Slavonic in the Roman Rite, but unfortunately we only have the low Mass, right, which would have been done without singing, as just kind of a dialogue Mass between the priest and the altar server. So let's go to these, the low Mass in Glagolithic. So right, it looks like a Latin Mass, but then if you hear closely, that's definitely not Latin. So this seems like the whole beginning of the prayers at the foot of the altar. So it's very interesting here. Now, when it comes to music, there isn't really much, because we don't really have a written form of this music, especially in the missals. We just saw chant, right? And that's maybe what would have happened is that there's a possibility that when Cyril and Methodius came to bring them liturgical music, they might have brought with them most likely the tunes that they knew, which is, right, Byzantine modes, Byzantine chants. But with the Roman Rite, they might have done a similar thing with what we'll see in the Huron Mass, wherein they simply took Gregorian chant, existing Gregorian chant, right? Like even then it wasn't fully developed as it was by the end of the Middle Ages. However, translated in Slavonic. We don't really have evidence of that right now, but right now, Glagolithic is still used during the liturgy in Ij, which is an island near Croatia on the Adriatic Sea. So we're going to listen to some Glagolithic chant during the liturgy on this island Ij. Very, very raw. It's very different from Gregorian chant, obviously. I mean, it's in harmony, right? It kind of reminds me of Georgian folk singing. Again, you guys can go and look on YouTube. Just type in Glagolithic chant or the Glagolithic Mass. You'll probably get what Colin is going to talk about, or probably talked about on Monday with Glagolithic Mass by Janacek. But if you type in maybe Glagolithic liturgy or something like that, you'll get videos and mini documentaries about this Mass or about the script itself. Now, moving on to the Huron Mass. So, the Huron people, if you guys look at the map, I know it's kind of small, but if you look inside the map, you'll see that right above Lake Ontario, we have the Tionanti people, the Huron people, and way up to the northeast, the Iroquois, all along the St. Lawrence River, moving south into Lake Ontario. The Huron people were, right, these Native Americans that lived there. And however, they're also one of the most successful missions in North America by French Jesuits, such as Saint John de Brebeuf and Saint Isaac Jogues. Just like Glagolithic, practical and theological steps were taken to write their language down. So one of the first people to do this was Saint John de Brebeuf, because he was that first wave of missionaries. So essentially what they did was that they pointed at objects, asking what they were, and the Native Americans would tell them, and they would learn the language like that. When the missionaries would be spread out a little more, they'd be along the Huron people and more along the St. Lawrence River where the Iroquois were. They would compare notes and eventually figure out a grammar of Huron and Iroquois. Now look, unlike Cyril and Methodius, John de Brebeuf wasn't probably prepared to make up a script for them. So they used what is now called as the Wendat alphabet. Back then it was just the Latin alphabet, representing certain sounds. So we have that right here on the bottom, a little diagram. Now, the Huron Mass, how did it work? Saint John de Brebeuf, and not only him, this was also after his time, he kind of saw the early developments of this type of Mass. But this was very common to the German, like, Singmesse, right? The vernacular Singmesse, where the Latin Mass would be happening, but the German people in the Renaissance or in the Middle Ages would sing their own German hymns. Sometimes like what they call like the three hymn sandwich, beginning, communion, and end. Maybe like that even in the 1600s. So, the priest would say Mass in Latin. Maybe it was most likely even a low Mass, but there would be singing, while the Native Americans in like a choir or in a schola would sing their favorite prayers, such as the Our Father, Hail Mary, Glory be, etc. These were prayers that were fairly easy to learn in their own languages, right? And maybe even connect them with a particular tune. Gradually, they started to sing more and more liturgical texts. So later, the whole Mass itself. So they would be singing both the ordinaries of the Mass, right? The Kyrie, Gloria, Credo, etc., and the propers, the things that would change from Sunday to Sunday. And they do that after a few years and decades, really. And over the centuries, they developed their own liturgical tradition, still in Gregorian chant, which we'll see, but in the Wendat script and in the Huron language, Huron or Iroquois. This doesn't only happen to the Huron people, but this is the one that's the most prolific. This happens to the Mohawk, as we'll see. This happens with basically any other, or a lot of the Native Americans that were evangelized by specifically the French Jesuits. And that's what I want to stress a little bit, is that this really only happens under the French Jesuits, because we've always been taught like the really poor history of treatment of Native Americans by the English, right? Especially along the 13 colonies. But then especially we hear it a lot of the Spanish near Mexico and in Central America and South America. But the French were really nice for some reason. They really cared about these people. They didn't want to kill them. They didn't think they were damned. They really wanted to evangelize and to share with them their culture, but to not completely eradicate their culture. Anyways, let's see here. So the question of papal permission, we'll see that in Cyril and Methodius, right, they went to the Pope for him to mediate, basically, between the Latin bishops and themselves, so that he could finally just make a final decision, like, this is okay, translate the scriptures in the Mass, whatever, right, into the Slavonic language, using the Glagolithic text. Here, we don't have evidence that it was even brought to the attention of the Pope. And which is quite unusual after the Council of Trent, because everything becomes really centralized. The Pope wants to know everything that's going on. But here it seems that local bishops, right, would give the imprimatur, or the seal of approval, for the publication of these texts, missals, and even a gradual. And that's what we're going to look at. We're going to look at a gradual from the 18th century, from the 19th century, and the Kanawake mission. So we see that books, chant, missals, the divine office, by the 18th century are translated and transcribed into Wendat and other Iroquois nation languages. The example that we're going to look at is in the Mohawk language, from the Kayatonsera Tiarawikwatha from St. Kateri's mission, Kanawake. St. Kateri was the first Native American to be canonized by the Catholic Church in the early 2000s by Pope Benedict, right? And just kind of shows that, people, even the evangelized people, the most recent evangelized people, so to say, the Native Americans, also, right, have the potential of being saints and even being venerated in the Catholic Church. So we're going to look at some pictures here. So right here we have, if you guys can recognize the tune, da 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 da. Da, 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 da. It's the Dies Irae. I was trying to look for familiar tunes, and I saw that, and I was like, okay, I think I recognize it. Ne Yahweh ni seran sanit, denotia tore tenonque. Very beautiful. I really wish I could hear a Tridentine Roman Mass, but in the Wendat language. I think that tickles my liturgical feathers right there. I mean, but anyways, let's see another one. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. I think this is the Sanctus, or the unused. No, sorry, Sanctus. Sang sayato keninti. And it says twice. There's a Roman numeral 2. Sayato keniti seweni otsiakionhe. Right, I don't really know how to pronounce it. I'm just kind of assuming here because it's the Latin alphabet. But I'd love to learn these languages someday. But see, we see this example of using Latin text, but with the Wendat language. And it's really beautiful, right? Because what I essentially want to say in conclusion is that, right, there's a certain amount of centrality and an imposition of Roman authority that the Catholic Church has really kind of shown throughout the last 2,000 years, especially in evangelization. Now, the positives of this, right, especially using Latin, is that there's a unity in language, therefore a unity in doctrine, and because of that, a unity of expression of the faith. However, right, we want to distinguish between unity and uniformity. Unity is good, uniformity not necessarily, and that's kind of probably the downside to using too much Latin, or Latin across the board, across all cultures, is if there's too much uniformity, there isn't enough expression of the diverse culture. Within the Catholic Church, there are 6 liturgical rites that are different, that are separate from Rome. Right? We have the Byzantine Rite, a lot of the Oriental churches, we have the Ukrainian churches, all of these that use the Byzantine Rite, Alexandrian Rite, and there are quite a few rites within the Latin Church itself in Western Europe. Most of these are just based on regional dialects, so to say, liturgical variations on a regional sphere. However, the Roman Rite, as we've seen in these 2 examples, and there are more, I wish I could spend more time on those, but it wouldn't be a 30-minute presentation. The Roman Rite is allowed to have some wiggle room to still express the culture in times of necessity. In that time of necessity, we saw that it was the Slavic people in which their language is so far away, and they didn't want to be influenced by the Latin bishops that much, but they also wanted to be part of the Byzantine influence. So Cyril and Methodius said, you guys have already experienced the Latin Mass. Let's give you the Roman Rite, but in the Slavonic tongue, through the Glagolithic script. And we see this, also in the Huron people. The Huron people in this case, right, are encountering Christianity for the first time. But it's not this necessarily this alien idea or this alien religion. It starts becoming very much a part of their culture. We kind of see this in Latin America with Spanish Catholicism, in what they call syncretismo, right? The syncretism between pagan beliefs and even Catholic beliefs, and figures such as the Virgin Mary. Even now, I'd say that after the Second Vatican Council, right, with Mass being in whatever the vernacular language is in the country, these two liturgies can actually be an excellent example of ecumenical efforts of the Catholic Church towards, right, the Orthodox, who have their own Byzantine Rite in their Slavonic tongue. We can introduce to them the beauty of the Roman Rite as well, as it was introduced by the original apostles to the Slavs, but then also to other indigenous tribes, where there's the right order, there's the order and the form of the Roman Rite, but it gets to have the flavor, right? The flavor form of that indigenous culture, of that indigenous language, right? Anyways, those are just my thoughts. And I wanted to just end with Psalm 117. Oh, praise the Lord, all ye nations. Praise him, all ye people. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you.